Gordon, good to see you.
Good to be seen. How are you?
Same place, yeah.
I am. I think you're in the same place.
No, I'm in a different place.
Okay, well, congratulations.
Are you allowed to walk in Los Angeles?
Not close to anyone.
Oh, really?
No. You have to have the mask, you have to have the whole deal. I have not been, other than in my friend's car, I have not been down to Ventura Boulevard for 25 days.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, you know, in Dubai, it's also like very hard. It's a complete lockdown. Like in Ukraine, it's more or less easy.
Yeah, I can't imagine Ukraine being too strict.
Yeah, you know, this old proverb that the strictness of our law is compensated by not obligatory, following it.
How about the laxity of its enforcement?
Oh, you know better. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah, Ukraine's kind of interesting that way.
Okay.
Okay.
So yeah, we will just wait a few more minutes and start. So basically, like.
But take your time. I'll drink my coffee.
I'll do some short intro about like these webinars that we also started to do within the hub in United Arab Emirates. And basically the goal is to educate people, is to bring knowledge, the cutting edge knowledge and technology to people who want it. And we're doing these webinars. We've been doing this for a long time. We're doing courses as Distributed Lab worldwide. We're doing certifications. We're writing books. We do like projects, also like for social industries and so on and so forth. So we will be doing more of these webinars on different topics. So if you would like to hear different topics, please write in comments. We will gather them and make them. So one of the next topics that we will do, at least with Gordon, will be about raising capital in the US and worldwide. And that will be for normal companies who need capital and who needs to know some simple like tricks and simple rules about what is possible to do, what is allowed to do, and what is back practice. So for example, once, I think it was once like 2 years ago, I posted on LinkedIn that I'm looking for like introductions to investors and to like some investment opportunities. And Gordon messaged me like 5 minutes after and said like, you'd better not to do this because this is soliciting of investment from public. So you have to be registered, you have to have prospectus, and it's basically an IPO. And the strictness of these rules, they kind of made ICOs and IEOs really popular in 2018. And actually the question right now that we've got in chat about the regulation of ICO, that is kind of, the Gordon will respond to that, but this is like an old news already. So the ICOs are being like kind of dead for many reasons.
Did you just say ICOs are dead?
Kind of, yeah.
Did you just say that? You know, we can have a nice big argument about that.
Okay, we have a separate discussion. Basically, looking at their prices, they're dead. I mean, so that might be people conducting them, and I know people who are conducting them still. But
what's worth more, a shit coin or a barrel of oil?
Barrel of oil.
Oh, really? Because it's trading at negative.
No, barrel of oil is not negative. It's the future.
An oil future. What's worth more, a shit coin or oil future?
The May future contract cost less because you have to store it somewhere, and that's basically was a like a game for those traders who don't understand what they're buying. It's good to read the Roman Suljic post about this. He had an examples in the past. He was trading derivatives. Yeah, he provided examples. So this is an interesting discussion. I know that everybody is an expert in oil now, and 2 weeks ago it was about coronavirus, and before it's about something else. Okay, so we will be doing these webinars, and like Gordon is an expert in securities law, and in programming. So he's not only a lawyer, but he's a developer. He has an IT consultancy company that specializes on providing services to lawyers. It's a very good combination. It's a very like lucrative combination of skills. Yeah, so Gordon will be sharing his knowledge today about money laundering, and actually not anti-money laundering, money laundering. So about what's going on with regulations, with FATF and AML, yeah, all these things. So Gordon, please introduce yourself. Yeah, we will start. So 7 minutes. Yeah.
Anyway, you did a good job, so I don't have much more to add. Hi, everyone. Appreciate you joining us virtually. My name is Gordon Einstein. I'm a lawyer in Los Angeles, California, licensed in the US. My practice focuses on crypto and blockchain, but that's more like an industry vertical. Of course, that has its own law, but it touches everything else like banking, securities law, privacy, intellectual property. So it's a pretty diverse practice. And I've been friends with Pavel since I think 2014. It's been a while. It's gonna be a while. So I was kind of looking forward to being in Dubai physically because I've never been there, but I guess this is my warm up virtually. So just tell me it's nice there.
You're broadcasted there.
There you go. So as soon as this calms down, I have many places to fly. I can't believe I haven't flown for months. It's not like me. So anyways, short and sweet introduction.
Okay, Gordon. So basically, as we all know, like 10 years ago, it was possible to send money here and there without any problem. Offshores were flourishing, and yeah, people sent USD. Latvia was like earning a lot of money. Now everything has changed, and businesses, even those businesses who like are pretty legitimate, they have issues with sending money between like paying their suppliers, sending money internationally, and it's getting tougher. And like many countries shut down the offshore like businesses accounts and introduced very strict regulations. The frozen money, we know, like Malta example, who has frozen money of many blockchain businesses. No, I mean, we are not talking only about blockchain businesses in general, but yeah. So in a pursuit for the bad apple, a lot of good apples were kind of affected. So what would you say on this? What are the trends? Yeah.
I'd say every observation you just made is correct, and it's a very broad question. There's always been, ever since 1970, with the Bank Secrecy Act in the United States at least, there's been recognition. By the way, if you're joining the call, just please mute yourself so there's no feedback on the call. Thank you. There's been a recognition of the idea of money laundering, that it's sort of non-trivial, and the strategy that the US has followed, and most other, but not all of the countries has followed it also, is focusing on the traditional financial system, meaning banks and other financial institutions, to control the flow of money laundering. And there's a lot of good reasons for that. That's basically where the money is. But those regulations were not enforced too vigorously. And for example, under this Bank Secrecy Act, banks or financial institutions would have to prepare reports about certain kinds of activities. Well, they didn't necessarily do it so much. And the US wasn't eagerly enforcing its point of view abroad. What happened is a few things. The first is that the US decided to use its money laundering regime and expand its scope to the ideas of tax avoidance and tax evasion, which kind of goes against the idea of traditional money laundering. And it also expanded the scope of its regulation and monitoring in response to both terrorism and the rise of other countries like Iran and China, perhaps, and North Korea. So there's been largely, but not entirely at the instigation of the US, there's been a rise in the level of money laundering regulation and the rising level of enforcement. And this was especially true after 9/11. Things kind of really kicked in then with the Patriot Act. What you're also seeing is not just the US, you're seeing other countries running into financial troubles. Their populations are aging. They have these huge welfare states that they can't really afford. And so the collection of tax revenue has become much more important than perhaps it used to be. You had this kind of golden period after World War II where everyone was doing so well, they didn't go so crazy with it. But now money's tight. It's about to get a lot tighter. So countries are looking at these transactions not just from a criminal money laundering perspective, but from a tax evasion perspective, not just the US, but everyone. And the Panama Papers, and I think you were alluding to that, the big dump of Fonseca, the law firm in Panama's documents on the public internet, made everyone kind of realize just how much corruption and tax evasion and money laundering there is. So the new Financial Action Task Force rules were largely in reaction to that. So there's been an ongoing trend towards more and more enforcement for a variety of reasons. I'll add in there also that enforcement is a lot easier when the world is connected and electronic, because you can enforce or review things programmatically. A big prerequisite, a real reason why the enforcement was relatively lax before is we had mostly a paper-based system, obviously going back a few decades. And it's just impossible to review tons and tons of paper. But now that everything's electronic, and we'll get to crypto, the capacity of governments to enforce these rules has increased. Therefore, their ability, once they have the capacity, they follow it with the action of actually doing it. So I don't think it's going to back off. The only thing is, do we fight back with crypto or with something else? So I'll pause for a moment.
Okay, I mean, this is the never-ending battle between like privacy and like some.
It is, and actually, let me address that for a second. There's some interesting policy aspects of this area. The very idea of calling it anti-money laundering assumes that the person is laundering money. All these rules. Oh, we have to do this because you're laundering money. Well, the traditional definition of money laundering required that there be what we call a predicate criminal act, meaning that the proceeds, the money you were trying to launder was originating in some kind of criminal activity. Absent of criminal activity, it used to be you couldn't be guilty of money laundering. Because you're laundering what? Now though, the definition has expanded. And most people would not argue with the idea that if you rob a bank, or you're selling drugs, or you're involved in like human trafficking, or blood diamonds, most people wouldn't argue that you should be denied the benefits of the financial system when to make use of your ill-gotten or illicit gains. Most people are cool with that. But what's happened, and you kind of got to it, is that these money laundering rules no longer apply to purely criminal activity, or on the other hand, almost everything has become criminal, things that aren't naturally criminal. So it's not just tax evasion, it's tax avoidance. It's me traveling to a country that another country doesn't like, even though I'm a private individual. It's a way of getting someone to throw even more against someone and put even more pressure on someone when the government wants them to do something. So it's kind of, its scope of application, not only has it become more aggressively enforced, but the scope of the reason or the definition of what is money laundering has expanded. And you're right, there's, on the other side, there's issues like privacy, autonomy, self-sovereignty, the idea of whether you're a subject of a country or whether you're a citizen of a country. And the classic statement of, if you don't have anything to hide, then you don't need to worry about privacy is of course ridiculous. We're seeing again and again that sometimes governments don't mean well. Sometimes governments mean well, but individual people who work for the government abuse their powers, and people outside of government can take advantage of what the government's powers to abuse them. So privacy is a big deal, and it's kind of threatened by these rules.
Okay, so Gordon, could you outline what we are going to learn in this webinar? What are you will be talking about the changes?
It's funny. I actually do have a presentation. I could flip through it on the screen, but the basic idea I think for this group is that the traditional anti-money laundering rules are now being applied to crypto, but not all crypto. And there's some difference in the application of the rules. So when I give a formal presentation on this, I talk about the current anti-money laundering laws, just so people understand the general scope. And then I talk about how it might apply to crypto. So, I think perhaps the best thing to do is for me to do like a summarized version of that presentation, just to leave some context, and then we can go from there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay, just checking.
You can actually switch on your presentation if you like. Yeah, would be great.
All right, I wasn't quite ready for that one, but let me see if I can do this.
You will do.
One moment here. And I am actually, there you go, perfect. 1 second. Guys, give me 1 second. I'm going to set this up. I think I can do this.
There's a green button, share.
No, I got it. I just want to make sure I share the right one. Client stuff. I'll have it in just 1 moment. Just give me a second. Oh, okay, there you go. So let's see here. Do you see the full screen of the presentation?
Yeah.
Is it full screen?
No, it's not full screen. It's just I see next slide as well.
Got it. Give me a moment here.
But that's fine. Yeah.
No. I got it. Just give me a second. We're almost there. Actually, you know what? I'm just going to do it so that you can see the PowerPoint Chrome, but it won't be the end of the world. All right. So, you're seeing my PowerPoint, but I think that's okay. And just to create a little bit more real estate. That's fine. Okay. So I gave a variant of this presentation before. I wasn't planning on doing it formally this time, but I'll just kind of roll with it because I think it provides a good context for understanding money laundering. So the two major recent innovations are AMLD5 and the FAFT recommendations. AMLD5 stands for the European Union's 5th Anti-Money Laundering Declaration, and FATF is the Financial Action Task Force, and they came out with some recommendations and quotes, but actually kind of directives about money laundering as well. But these laws have different scope. They have slightly different subjects, and they have slightly different applicability. So we'll kind of go through there. So before we dive into what this law changes or what these laws implement, it's good to understand the law in general. Otherwise, how can you understand what changed? So let's dive into that for a moment. So Paul, as I alluded to before, there's a traditional definition of money laundering. This is kind of like money laundering version 1. And it says it up there on the screen, of course. It's the conversion process whereby the illicit proceeds, and each one of these terms have a lot of meaning. It's the conversion process whereby the illicit proceeds of criminal activity, not non-criminal activity we don't like, but criminal activity, lose their association with the criminal activity and thus become useful wealth. So we'll address one of these step by step, but it's key to understand that money laundering is, number one, a process. It's not just a one-time thing. It's a system, if you like. And illicit proceeds of criminal activity means it's not just any money. It's not necessarily like money from North Korea, because that doesn't make it automatically illicit. But traditionally, it was the proceeds of criminal activity. Like, you had to prove you were a government that there was criminal activity going on in order for there to be money laundering. And this definition is broadened. It's been slowly broadening for a long time, but when crypto arose, it really put, like crypto does with everything else, a catalyst into that process. So again, purest definition of money laundering, there has to be a crime. If there's no predicate crime, then it's not money laundering. Now, keep in mind that some things can be both a regulatory violation and also a crime. And the example that I like to give is securities fraud. If you sell securities that if you intentionally lie about the securities you're selling, or you try to raise money selling securities that don't actually exist, that's securities fraud. That's both a cause for a lawsuit. It's cause for the SEC, which is a civilian or civil regulatory agency, to step in and take regulatory action against you, but it's also potentially a cause for the Department of Justice in the United States to bring criminal charges against you. So one activity can cause many legal consequences, but criminal activity specifically was thought to be a prerequisite for there to be money laundering. Now, of course, the definition of money laundering has sort of expanded. It has what I would call a geopolitical angle. This was always the case a little bit, but it really kicked in after 9/11. There's now an anti-financing terrorism or counter-terrorism financing aspect of it, which we try to impose against organizations like Hezbollah, but also against, say, their sponsors like Iran. There's a sanctions enforcing aspect of money laundering, because part of the leverage that the US and others try to apply is to starve what we call rogue states by limiting their access to the financial system. Again, you're seeing North Korea and Iran. And you're also seeing this sort of tax revenue protection aspect of money laundering. As countries increase their ability and desire and level of taxation, more people don't want to pay tax. And then you see money laundering rules applied to those people because the governments are desperate to keep the revenue inside the system. So what's the point of anti-money laundering? Well, it's not necessarily to stop someone from receiving money in exchange for their criminal activity, strangely enough. Money laundering is not so much worried about a drug dealer receiving $1 million for their drugs, because that's just the original crime, or part of the original crime. It's much more interested in then denying that criminal access to the financial system. Now, why does that matter so much? The basic idea is that no matter how much money you might make from criminal activity, until it enters into the banking system, it's not actually wealth. It's not actually capital. I'd say wealth and capital are resources, financial resources, that you have persistent, safe access to and can use how you like going forward. That's very different from just getting a fast payoff because of a crime. To really move and really operate at scale, you need access to the financial system. And even though we don't like criminals being paid money or cash outside in connection with their criminal activity, they only really can benefit from those proceeds if they have access to the financial system. So again, the goal is anti-money laundering is financial system or banking system denial. And of course, it's not just denial, it's monitoring. So suppose the bad guy gets his money into the financial system, and it happens. Well, part of it is to see where that money is going. It's surveillance. So an aspect of anti-money laundering isn't necessarily preventing access to the system, but maybe allowing that access, but then monitoring what's going on.
So this is the role of Palantir, for example.
Say again?
This is the role of Palantir.
Palantir, yeah, well, Palantir is very interesting. I think we're all kind of living in Palantir now. Palantir definitely was ahead of its time, and I think most of your audience is probably familiar, but Palantir was a very early sort of machine learning pattern recognition software that took in a million signals, to use sort of the crypto term, and could engage in predictive activity about what the bad guys were doing. You know, you could look at a million ships shipping containers and choose the 3 that were busting sanctions. It was sort of a, you know, a huge surveillance AI system. I think it was ahead of its time, but now everyone, including Facebook, is doing that. So one idea behind money laundering is you can't monitor everything. The government's resources are scarce. So you want to put your surveillance and your enforcement where you get the biggest bang for the buck. And that has traditionally been financial institutions, banks and things like banks. If you want to think about the financial system as a network, those are the major nodes, the banks, and everyone else just kind of spindles off of them. And when something wants to get from one place to another place, you can think of the banks as these huge routers. If you control the routers, you control the network, and it doesn't really matter what happens on some small side network, because eventually, if you want to really take advantage of the network, you have to go through one of these bank routers. So the surveillance of the government has always been on these banks, always been on these sort of network routers of the financial system, if you get my analogy. But again, this premise of controlling the nodes of the network begins to break down given the nature of crypto. Because even though we can talk about the financial system like a computer network, it's not actually a computer network. And when you try to apply the anti-money laundering model to a computer network, it doesn't quite hold up so well. Okay, so again, the point of AML is to deny people from the criminals access to the banking system, because the banking system is very useful, and also to stop them from hiding their proceeds in that system. Okay, so let's talk about cash. You know, what's up with cash? It's interesting that the subtitle to his paper was, I think it was like a peer-to-peer digital cash system. Or some, probably know the exact language, but it's interesting that he said cash. He didn't say money. He said cash, right? And that always, even as a newbie, struck me. You know, why wasn't Bitcoin peer-to-peer digital money? No, it's peer-to-peer digital cash. And I think Satoshi's a very smart guy in ways I keep on appreciating, you know, far after the fact. Physical cash really lends itself to criminal activity because it is a way of having wealth that is not a commodity, but is immediately transferable for everything else. Everyone loves cash. Cash is king. And physical cash is what's made the criminal world go around for a very long time. And for the longest time, most people had physical cash, or they had the gold equivalent of it. They paid in gold, they paid in physical dollars, all that other stuff. So most crime happens in the form of physical cash. That's the payoff. It's very convenient, but there's a problem with physical cash, which is it doesn't scale well. It's one thing to keep $1,000 in your pocket. It's another thing to keep $1 million in your house. You're in danger if you have $1 million, or you're in danger if you're trying to use $1 million in a drug deal. It doesn't scale well. So the problem for criminals for the longest time, and we've all seen this in movies like Scarface and Blow and everything else, is that cash is great in the beginning. You have a great life with it. You get all the girls, you get all the parties, you get all the houses. But at some point, you have so much physical cash, you can't do anything with it. That's what messed up Johnny Depp and Blow, and what messed up Al Pacino and Scarface. And it's true. Physical cash is a real pain. You can't do anything with it. And so criminals, especially because they have so much physical cash, have been driven into the banking system whether they like it or not. It's not just the advantages of the financial system, it's that they didn't really have a choice. But maybe kind of crypto is challenging that now. Okay, so again, the banking system is where the payoff is. Okay, so let's talk about the 3 phases of money laundering. This is like a little guide on how to launder money. There's placement, just think PLI, okay? Plea. There's placement. which is when, if I commit a crime and I have funds and I want to actually spend them sometime in the future, not just keep them in my basement, I need to introduce them into the financial system somehow. Now, if I walk into a bank with $1 million, that's going to be suspicious and it's going to be reported. So that's not so great. So traditionally, what bad guys have done is they found some sort of weak external edge node of the financial system, introduce the funds there, and then work their way towards the middle. So it can be stores that sell gold for cash, for example, or fake trade invoices, or certain kinds of real estate deals, or even valuable art. They would find valuable art dealers. They would find these sort of peripheral nodes that they would place the funds into so they could kind of get them into the banking system. The next step is layering. Layering is when you disguise the source of the funds by sort of scrambling them, or to use the Bitcoin language, putting them through a mixer. You engage in very many transactions. You divide up the funds, you mix them with other funds, you transfer them from country to country, you route them through companies that no one knows who owns, but may or may not be legitimate, but you can't prove they didn't do anything wrong. And the idea of layering is to sort of take the crime and the money and break the relationship by getting the origin of the money so scrambled that you can no longer tie it back to the crime. Once the origin of the money has been sufficiently scrambled, of course, you want to make use of that money. You want to have it available to you. And that's the final phase. That's integration. It's when the money that's now lost its smell sort of comes back home at rest in a manner you can control in the financial system. So say your own bank accounts. But because of the placement and layering process, even though it's in your own bank accounts or in the bank accounts of an entity you control, you're not under the threat that you would have been before, because there's no more of a provable relationship between that money and the crime that led to that money. So this is traditional money laundering. Okay, now, of course, we've had all these developments with crypto and the big Panamanian law firm revelations, and it's made life very exciting. And so in 2020, COVID or not, we're facing a very new, unusual activity. So I always like to make this point when I'm doing this presentation. The banking system is great, it offers all this functionality, but it's fundamentally, from a criminal's perspective, the solution to the problem of having physical cash. It's interesting to think about it that way. The banking system, for a criminal, the banking system exists because it provides a solution to physical cash. Physical cash, again, like I said, it's hard to transport, it's dangerous, it burns, it's all this other stuff. When you have a lot of it, it's a pain. You can't do anything with it. So the solution is the banking system. But is that true anymore with crypto? Because crypto has all the benefits of physical cash, but it doesn't have any of the downsides. It's hard to steal from people. It's easy to make change. It's easy to move around. It's easy to keep it private and anonymous. It's really it's like cash without any of the downsides. So that made me, when I started thinking about this, that made me appreciate Satoshi's subtitle even more. The fact that he didn't say digital money, but he said digital cash. Because cash is, of course, a bearer instrument. If you have it, the presumption is that you own it. And if I take cash, if someone commits a crime and they have cash and they buy my iPhone off me for cash, and I don't know or have reason to know that the cash that they are giving me is originally from a criminal activity, once that cash is in my hands, it's pretty much safe. I'm a holder in due course. I'm safe. So Pablo, maybe we should talk about this at the end. That's one issue where Bitcoin, for example, might be a little bit more sketchy, because you can trace all the transfers of crypto in a way where you can't trace all the transfers of cash.
That would be my later question, because like Bitcoin is indeed traceable, but there are already technology that can prevent traceability. Like Monero.
Yeah, it's an arms race. We'll talk about it, and I'll wrap up pretty fast just so we can kind of get to the Q&A and all that stuff. But just my thesis for this presentation is that banks solve, from a criminal perspective, banks solve the issue of criminals get physical cash. That's what they do, and they get a lot of it. That's a problem. Banks traditionally have been the solution to that problem. But dealing with banks then allows for government surveillance because governments are looking at the banks. Well, isn't crypto wonderful because it solves all of the problems of crypto, but you get to avoid the banking system, which is where the government has traditionally applied its anti-money laundering rules. So no wonder the governments are threatened by crypto. It's operating outside of their network surveillance or their routers, right? So, okay, so what's the idea behind AMLD5 and these new FAFT recommendations? So we've gone over sort of the traditional rules. These are two laws that are really kicking in 2020 and beyond. Just to remind everyone, the AMLD5, fifth money laundering directive from the EU, and the FATF is an international organization, Financial Action Task Force, that produced recommendations that aren't enforceable, but they're taken very seriously. So the bottom line is, what have both these laws done? They've expanded the scope of the monitoring function that were traditionally assigned to banks and expanded the scope of that function and those requirements to non-banking financial institutions that are involved in crypto. So for example, exchanges. Okay, if I'm a crypto exchange, there was a decent argument before that the transactions that happened on my exchange were not subject to the normal monitoring rules or reporting rules that were applicable to other financial institutions because I wasn't engaging in money laundering. It wasn't money. Well, that was a nice theory, and you could have gone both ways on that. But what both these rules do is they say, nice try. To the extent that fiat or cash is coming into your system or going out of your system, you are now a financial institution for our purposes. Therefore, we're going to apply all the money laundering rules to you, and you need to know your customer, monitor transactions, do reports, all that other fun stuff. Well, that's really tough. Being a money transmitter or financial institution and complying with all those rules is difficult. And we've seen in Europe some companies that were smaller that could not comply with AMLD5 either leave the EU, go out of business, or merge with others. So it's challenging. And just real quick, this law became effective January 10th, 2020. So this year, it also addressed certain issues with the counter-terrorism financing. AMLD5 is a little bit different from the FATF rules, which is, there was a big pushback in Europe once the Panama Papers leaked. There was a lot of anger at both tax evasion, but also tax avoidance, which is not criminal. There's a difference between tax avoidance and tax evasion. Tax avoidance is the non-criminal organizing of your affairs, so to minimize the amount of tax that you pay. Some people think that's shady. Some people think you should pay, your full amount of tax all the time. But there's a famous justice on the U.S. Supreme Court, Justice Brandeis, who said that it's, everyone does right. You actually made it a positive when you arrange your affairs without going crazy with it, so as to minimize the amount of taxes you pay. That's a legitimate activity. That's separate from tax evasion. Tax evasion is either not reporting your income or over-reporting your expenses or your cash outflows, basically lying, so that you pay less tax. Tax avoidance is telling the truth and paying less. Tax evasion is lying and paying less. Well, the Panama Papers revealed not just tax evasion, but tax avoidance, but it was on such a scale that it made everyone very angry. And all the political leaders of all these countries were setting up all these offshore companies that no one could prove that they owned and laundering money through there or running their money through there so as to avoid taxation. And people got pissed off. It was just nuts. So a big rule with AMLD5 is that the beneficial owners, like the actual owners of companies, not just the paper owners, not just the nominees, have to be reported to the jurisdictions where an entity is being formed. And also, if those change often, those changes of ownership need to be reported. And also, the ownership of these entities needs to be public record. So if anyone has set up a company recently in Malta or anywhere else in the EU, you'll see that there's a new form that you have to fill out where you actually list the beneficial owners of the company. It's not just that you have a nominee, director, or shareholder, or secretary. So the idea was to make these entities more transparent. So they're not necessarily illegal to have anymore, but you can't hide behind them. And of course, that has an impact on money laundering, because remember, the second layer or second process in money laundering is layering. Well, if you can't obscure that you own the different steps in the path to cleaning your money, then anyone can tie it back to you. Okay, so again, the AMLD5 applied these rules to crypto exchanges and maybe also to crypto custodianships. Paul, we should talk about this also. There's a debate about whether or not custodial wallet is a financial institution, or the self-custodial wallet. We will have to deal with it. Now there is some upside to AMLD5. The banks have traditionally avoided working with exchanges and other participants in the crypto industry because they said, well, wait, we have all these anti-money laundering rules, and since you're not a compliant institution, we can't deal with you because we're exposing ourselves to risk. Well, if all these exchanges, all these crypto exchanges now need to, and I got my cat here, you can probably see its tail. If all these crypto exchanges need to now comply with the anti-money laundering rules, there, my cat is going to join. If they need to comply with these rules, then it kind of takes away the reason for the banks to not work with them anymore. So there's actually a little bit of an opportunity here. There's another opportunity in that different countries in the EU are applying this directive differently. So as long some countries are more strict, some countries are less strict, it's changing kind of from moment to moment. But it's just like Estonia with the money license. There's some countries are good at it, and it's worth setting up there, even though theoretically it applies to every country in the EU. And it's important to remember that AMLD5, AMLD5, to the extent it applies to crypto, only applies to crypto and fiat transactions. Fiat to crypto or crypto to fiat. It does not apply yet to crypto. So that's an interesting little detail. So if you're in an exchange that's purely dealing crypto to crypto, in theory, AMLD5 doesn't interact with it. Okay, now the FATF recommendations are different fundamentally. The EU recommendations have the power of law. Sorry, give me 1 second, please. Come on, please. All right. So AMLD5, it is EU law. It's enforceable EU law. The FATF recommendations, also, which were kind of inspired by the Panama Papers revelations, are recommendations put out by this organization, and then it's up to countries to comply with them. But countries that don't comply with them are actively pointed out to the other countries that are part of this organization and sort of shamed into compliance. And very few countries hold out anymore. There's very little leverage to be a country that doesn't comply with these rules, because then you lose access to the banking system and you lose access to your correspondent banks. These recommendations do apply to crypto transactions, which is a little bit scary. I haven't seen them enforced so well everywhere yet, but they could potentially apply to all such transactions. The FATF recommendations also impose something called the funds travel rule, which is Justin Finecki's favorite topic. The idea is that if you have a sequence of financial institutions engaging in passing along funds, you have to include with that transfer of funds almost like headers, if you want to use an internet analogy, showing the entire route of those funds from the beginning financial institution to the ending financial institution, showing everyone who participated along the way. So that's pretty onerous, but it's kicking in. Again, these are non-binding recommendations, but they're pretty strong. So I think I'm gonna pause. That's the end of this, and let's just open it back up. I think I'll stop sharing my screen too. Here we go. And I see lots of chats. Actually, Simon, just to, maybe I missed, but I want to just clarify something. I was using Estonia as an analogy for the idea that even though the e-money license, the EU e-money license is applicable to every country in the EU, Estonia is sort of known, at least to me, as a good place to go get that license and then passport it to the other countries of the EU. So I was pointing out that there's community law in the EU, but it doesn't, it's not, there's wiggle room, or there's room for improvisation, or there's latitude, I guess you could say, in the way that different countries apply and interpret this law, so long as they're within the general guidelines of the law. So likewise, with the AMLD5, I think there's going to be an element of forum shopping or jurisdiction shopping, where the countries that apply it rationally and have a good system of regulation will attract crypto business, and countries that are slow or punitive or don't quite do a good job will not attract that business. Pavel, you want to jump back in? And
yeah, Gordon, what I wanted to, somebody was saying something. Okay, so basically what I want to understand is like a few questions. First of all, the technology soon will allow permissionless anonymous transfers.
Right.
And that's like will be the reality, and you can't really stop it. It doesn't mean you have to do crime, it is what it is. And how is like regulatory bodies are going to address this issue, because they won't be able to come to one entity and just track everybody who's doing like in a bank. So it's like if you use Zcash or Monero for payments, I mean, it won't be only them, it will be many systems that will be permissionless and anonymous. So what do you think it will happen?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. You're pointing out.
I'm sorry. Just to clarify for the audience, imagine that somebody is running the warehouse with like gold or whatever, and the warehouse itself should know if it's gold or some regulated asset, should know its customers, and then technically it will be possible to create like a smart contract structure where, for example, some guy has an account in this gold vault and is able to issue derivatives. And these derivatives, they will be kind of trustless too. So if somebody buys a derivative, they know that they own a gold through a chain, but still own a gold. Because it won't be possible to mess with the accounting system. So like using again crypto and atomic swaps and smart contracts, it will be possible. So technically everybody, that's exactly what stable coins do. They say, okay, we some regulate stable coins. They say we track who owns the first issuance and who does the redemption, but we do not track who is doing the secondary market transactions, because they happen on Ethereum, for example. So technically they're clean. And this technology will be accessible for everybody very soon. So, and it will be possible to exchange value in any asset, derivatives for the value, and it will be like a global barter. So what's next then? What do you think?
It's a challenging, you're raising the right issue. It's a challenging world for the regulators, and it's a challenging world for those of us who want to have this take off. So you brought up a lot of good issues there. Keep in mind that the traditional way that money laundering surveillance and enforcement has been applied is at the nodes, right? At these financial institutions, at these banks. And that the resources, even though there's vast technical capacity that's associated with these regulators, they don't have unlimited resources. So they focused on these nodes, on these financial institutions, both because that's where the money flows were, but also to conserve resources. Well, if you have a true decentralized peer-to-peer system of transferring money, even if you knew who these people are, just the volume of transactions is huge, number one. Number two is the current law doesn't apply to these people. The current law applies to financial institutions. There's no requirement that if I interact with you directly, person to person, Okay, doing our regular business, not financial transmitter business, but just our regular business. Unless I have some reason to believe it's criminal, I'm not a financial institution. I'm not regulated under those laws. So not only is it hard to track, but there's a really good question about whether the law even applies to these parties. They're just people, I don't need to report whenever I pay someone cash for something. Now, sometimes I do have to report if I get a receipt of over $10,000 in the US, it gets a little tricky, but that's more like a surveillance function. It's a criminal not to report it, but it's not criminal to have it. Then there's the issue of what happens if you make these people truly anonymous, like Zcash, or highly anonymous, and anonymity is not a choice. Like, people aren't trying to hide anymore. It's just the nature of the system. What are you gonna do if you're a regulator? That's the government's either gonna have to expand the definition of the law, which is really troubling because now they're really poking their nose into personal affairs, or they're gonna try to kill the industry, which I think they are in some cases, or they're gonna lose. So it's exciting. I know you brought up several points, but you brought up so many good points. I can't remember them all. So
yeah, one of my questions is, like, in UAE currently and many other Gulf countries, there is no tax. So technically, if there is no tax, there is no tax evasion. So there means there is no money laundering, because what would you launder if you don't have government money? So do you think it's a good approach, and it should be followed by other countries, is just to say we won't have tax and we'll simplify life for everybody?
Well, the government has to pay. I mean, how do you pay for stuff if you're a government? It's one thing if you're getting U.S. naval-based revenue, or have oil, or have wealthy neighboring countries that want to pay your bills. But if you aren't those things, if you're making money, look, and I don't know too much about the UAE's economy, but it's nice not to have to pay tax, but the government needs money from somewhere. Okay, and there's traditional ways of getting money. There's resource extraction. So if you have oil underneath the ground, if you got lots of oil, at least before now, you would just drill it, bring it out of the ground, and pay for the government. You don't need to tax your people. Or you can have customs that you impose on imported goods. Well, if you do that enough, you don't need to tax. But you need to make money from somewhere. And when you're an industrial economy, like the US, like Europe, like China, your revenue really has to come from economic activity within your borders. So you need to tax, unfortunately. The EU makes it more painless because they have the VAT system, unlike the United States. So it's kind of imposed every step of the way. Russia has it too. But you need to do it. So sure, it's a good policy for countries that can afford to have that policy, but it's not something that can be widely employed. And if you're an industrial economy like the US, you are naturally not going to appreciate it when other countries don't have taxes, because the reason, especially if they're applying that to your own citizens, the reason that your citizens are routing their transactions through those countries is to either avoid or evade taxes, and those other countries know why they're doing what they're doing. So I say it's a mixed bag. Also, what I've seen recently is, especially within the European Union, when some country tries to get a sort of, they lower their taxes, even perfectly legally, even not to hide revenue, but just to get an advantage, the other countries seem to push them around and not appreciate it. So there's kind of a bully factor going on.
Yeah, this is an interesting question, because, like, if UAE, for example, has earned money on pumping oil, and it allowed them to just eliminate tax and maybe do it for some time in Saudi Arabia as well. So, and that's their problem technically, right? So that's the problem of countries who don't have the resources to do that. And there are many differences in the way how countries like do the monetary policy and how they deal with welfare and with military expansion and with like social public sector, etc., etc. So do you see there will be like clashes between these cultures and or some like the
100%.
US
I
will
mean,
prevail?
there already is. Look, you see it geopolitically. There's resource extraction economies. Okay, so that'd be Saudi Arabia, Russia. They're primarily, there's an economic term for it. I think, it's rent basically, or it's rent-seeking behavior. They're taking what's in the ground, bringing it out of the ground, and then selling it to people outside of the country. And it's kind of like an inheritance you get from your parents. You didn't, it's not immoral, but you didn't create it or earn it in the same way as, say, from manufacturing. Now that has a slight moral tinge to it, but I don't actually mean it that way. It's great if you have it. Okay, the U.S. actually started exporting oil, so it's great that we have it. I'm not complaining. But your economic and governance model is going to be inherently different when you're making money off of extracting resources in the ground than when you're manufacturing things or providing services. Because when you're extracting resources out of the ground, especially if you have foreign companies doing it for you, your population of your country is not the one that's producing the economic wealth. It's the resources in the ground that are producing the economic wealth. So you basically then, if you're the governing clique, you try to take as much of the money as you can for yourselves and then distribute the rest of it to the population so they calm down and stay and relax. And one way you try to keep them calm is by not taxing them and providing subsidies. And you pay for that with the resources you got out of the ground. If you are resource poor, say Japan, for example, you don't have a choice other than to make money by having your people be productive. So you have to educate them, you have to get them working, you have to tax their revenue. And if they go, if in a resource extraction environment, the population goes on strike, it's not the end of the world for the economy. But if you have a manufacturing type economy or resource poor economy, if the population goes on strike, then it's a big deal. So you see the way the countries make their money affects their politics and it affects the flavor of their societies. And when you have a resource extraction economy and when you have a manufacturing economy, they're just going to feel differently about how things work, and they are going to clash. Actually, it's interesting about China. China obviously is a manufacturing economy. They're not blessed with bountiful. They're big, but they're not necessarily blessed with bountiful natural resources. They're in an interesting part of the world, and maybe they have rare minerals or rare earths, but they're not like overflowing with oil or minerals. So, of course, for them, not only is taxation important, but they have a sort of bribery, capital outflow concern also. So they try to impose a sort of regulatory. China has their own version of anti-money laundering because the wealthy people are scared about the stability of the economy over the long term, and so they're trying to bring their money out all the time. So their nodes of control are on the points flowing out of the country.
Okay, I have the last question, which is like, in a given circumstances where we need to go to digital economy anyway, without papers, and it has to be, the economy should work at the speed of the internet, not like the speed of 19th century world. And given this AML KYC regulations, do you see the possibility of having this all AML like seamlessly working behind the scenes? So like the business work normally, and if they are good people, then everything goes okay. If somebody becomes criminal, whatever, transaction doesn't happen. But nobody needs to supply documents like every day. So do you think it'll be seamless?
So I think this is actually a great idea for your crowd here. I think AML will become an API soon, or should be. So it should be completely automated and integrated with the digital economy. So any Zcash is Zcash, and if you want to bypass the system or maintain privacy, I personally feel there's a very good place for that. But if you want to build a AML compliant or KYC compliant system, whatever you're doing needs to have the ability to be, needs to offer up an API surface to a regulatory layer. And these two layers should interact seamlessly. And I think an entrepreneur of the future, or maybe an entrepreneur of now, will build something that can take advantage of the APIs that are being revealed by the money transfer system in order to seamlessly apply AML and KYC to those nodes or to those transactions.
Yeah, the one of the aspect of my question is like when doing something good, like in a properly, is cheaper, easier, more usable than doing it in a distorted way, then people will just follow the good. It's like one of examples is like Netflix becomes so accessible that people don't bother themselves to like doing torrents, or then there are
right, okay,
service where you rather pay than like do it yourself. Just so in having these regulations and technically and rules, we need to like good people and good businesses should be doing better than those who don't want to follow and don't want to pay, and etc. That's the ideal against situation. Now we have the reverse situation. Those who are doing something bad, they're just using the fastest way, the cheapest, less problems. And those who are doing like normal things, they have to deal with all the paperwork and etc. and prove that they're not criminals. It's like the
presumption of guilt.
Yes, presumptions of guilt. Yeah, exactly.
It's a great point. So let me throw this out there. So Russia did something pretty neat recently, which is they reformed the way that they collect taxes. Everyone, when you go to a restaurant in Russia, you pay at a terminal, and different companies you pay using a terminal. That terminal is provided by the government. The government and the results of that transaction immediately go into the central accounting system, and tax is immediately imposed, but it's seamless and it's low, and it's pay as you go, and you don't even have to worry about it. So the bookkeeping and the accounting and the tax payments, it all just kind of just happens seamlessly and automatically, and the tax rate is low enough that it's reasonable and it's not worth bothering with. So it's quite inconvenient to not use those terminals, and even if it's legal, it would keep you being small, and it's quite convenient to use them because it's so easy and great. So to use your Netflix example, yeah, I mean, you want the path of least resistance to be compliance. You want the most beneficial path to be compliance, and you want that path to be easy. So to the extent that crypto and blockchain and the rest of this can make compliance easy and flow, I think governments would end up making a lot more money. It's the crazy punitive nature of these money laundering rules and know your customer, and just the consequences for getting anything wrong, even when you try to do a good job. That's a little bit scary, and it's also a little bit scary that governments have such a. It's funny they have some of them have a negative view of crypto because of what the threat that crypto represents. But the threat that crypto represents is kind of because the government maybe has a negative view of them. So I think there's room for some segments of the crypto industry to make friends with the AML KYC compliance aspect, and that should be a marriage made in heaven. Because one thing we alluded to before, one thing we mentioned, every Bitcoin transaction is known. You don't necessarily know who did it, but every transaction is known. So to the extent that you want a perfect auditable trail of transactions, blockchain is pretty good if you're the government. I think that's why we're seeing these central bank digital currencies finally getting some traction. So interesting times. Papa, do you want to ask a question from the audience, or are we done with time, or what do you think?
Yeah, we are open to questions from the minute one. Your cat wants to ask a question too. See.
Actually, you do me for take it from there and read it to me, so I make sure I understand it correctly.
Sorry, I don't see.
If you have a question directed to Pavel, or put it in the general chat, and he'll rephrase it for me.
Yeah, you can ask if you like. You can ask in Russian. I will translate Ukrainian.
Yep. Russian, Ukrainian, English.
Yeah. So okay, while we're waiting, is from my perspective, is from what I hear, is that basically we are in a turbulent times, and nobody knows how it's going to turn out. Because from one perspective, if we just follow all the rules like as it is now, it's very like it's a heavy tax on business currently. All this paperwork, and we don't have the laws that say that this tax should be like kind of reduced by automated, because now business is responsible, financial institution is responsible for following the rules and for not working with criminals. And who is the criminal knows not the financial institution, but the government. So technically government is responsible for defining who is the criminal, but the financial institution is responsible for being like safe.
They have monitoring and they have a proactive, they have a training requirement. They have to know your customer proactively, and they have a reporting requirement. Now, I also want to clarify something. Very little of this is paper-based. It's almost all digital now. The reports you have to file with FinCEN, which is the Financial Crime Enforcement Network, they're all digital. The issues are that the application of these laws is not.
Sorry to interrupt. This is tricky because if normal business opens account in a European bank, they have to send them the bill of utility bill, the proof from a lawyer, some references.
Got it. I see. The institutions are reporting digitally, but you're right. With the person accessing the institution is to a certain extent stuck in the paper world. Yes, I agree. Yeah. It's very inefficient. And to the extent that can be digitized, or it would flow things, make things much better.
Yeah, we have two questions. Like, what about micropayments below $1,000 per transaction? Like,
okay, so in the U.S. and in other countries, to a certain extent, small transactions are, well, if you're a financial institution and you're opening up an account, you need to know your customer, period. It doesn't matter if they come in with a $10 deposit or $1 million deposit. You need to know your customer before you open up the account. That's number one. Number two is if there's large transactions or suspicious transactions, there's a document called a SAR, a Suspicious Activity Report, that you need to file. You also, in the United States, and this got spread to other countries recently, need to report any cash transaction over $10,000, right? So there's, that automatically requires a report. So if I go to a bank and I make a deposit of $10,000, the bank files, and that deposit's cash. The bank has to file a report with the government. Now, of course, everyone thinks they're clever and thinks they're going to deposit $9,000. Well, if you're doing that once, then maybe you are clever. But there's an idea called structuring, which is if you do a bunch of smaller transactions, less than that $10,000 number or whatever it is, but you do them for the purposes of evading the $10,000 reporting requirement, that doesn't work, okay? Because what will happen is the government and the bank will apply the structuring concept to this and say, look, you might have tried to do all these separate little deposits, but in real life, this is a way of hiding the fact you were conducting this $10,000 transaction. So we're going to pull these together and make it as if you had done $10,000. Now, for peer-to-peer consumer or business transactions, unless you think there's a crime in place, these money laundering laws don't apply. Okay, you don't have the reporting requirement. Well, I should say the reporting requirements and the know your customer requirements that under these laws don't apply. So a bunch of micropayments between individuals doesn't naturally fall underneath these laws. So
and that's actually why Visa and MasterCard are doing a lot of peer-to-peer transactions that are kind of like.
Well, those are financial institutions, right? But if it's a true peer-to-peer transaction like Bitcoin, okay, and take a case of microtransaction, if you have something that where the transaction fees are like nothing, and you can send like a billionth of a cent, and it'd be worth it. Okay, the peer-to-peer nature of that is not subject to the same requirements that a financial institution has. So it's not the fact that it's a micropayment per se, it's the fact that the parties doing it aren't financial institutions.
Interesting. Okay, and the other question is like, are there any requirements for proof of location? That's AML.
Yeah, I saw the geolocation one. That was actually, no one's ever asked that, so I want to compliment the person who said that.
Michael asked it for two times already.
Yeah. Okay. Listen, I have to compliment you on that question. So I think with geolocation, you're implying an internet-based transaction, and it's a good point because for example, with ICOs, if you're trying to avoid, and I see, if you're trying to avoid U.S. securities law, for example, and saying that no Americans should buy these tokens, is it enough for someone to simply click a box on your ICO and say, I'm an American, or are you under some kind of responsibility to do IP filtering so that someone, even if they're lying and clicking that box, you still exclude them? Of course, they can use a VPN or something like that. And in the ICO securities law context, I wouldn't say that there's a requirement that you geolocate, but it's a much stronger argument if you're getting in trouble later that you were using geolocation, because at least you made some effort to filter out the people. So I don't think that with financial transactions, I don't think that the IP address of the other party is directly applicable to the law of whether or not you've done your due diligence on that customer, right? I haven't seen a document saying that part of your KYC is to do sort of network flow analysis and see where the transaction originated from. Oh wait, this is an Iranian IP address. Oops. Okay, but I think on a practical level, I'm thinking about this for the first time in a money transmitting context. I think on a practical level, it's very smart to do it. And if you geo-block certain locations or you IP address locate where this person's coming from, it shows a level of diligence and seriousness that would either prevent issues, or if there is an issue, at least you have some sort of record of your efforts to mitigate so that you can prove that you were acting in good faith, even the actual transaction was bad. So, Miguel, do you want to, if you want to take yourself off mute and follow up on that, you're welcome to.
Yeah, actually, I have some enhanced question on that issue, because I remember it AML Directive 4. There was a 4 level of due diligence according to the high risk or non-high risk country and according to volume. And actually, there was some small requirement in case of client is on a significant distance from the bank where he was opened the bank account. This activity and this deposit should be treated like suspicious. So are there any enhanced requirements for location, or maybe requirements to just track the distance to bank or bank account or address? I don't know, whatever. I
don't know if it's enhanced, but there's part of the analysis that a bank is supposed to do is this an unusual transaction given how things are normally done? So what's a good example? If I'm buying tropical birds from Iceland, that may be, there's nothing illegal about buying tropical birds, but no one buys tropical birds from Iceland because it's not tropical. So it looks funny. And likewise, if I'm in Argentina, why am I opening up a bank account in New Zealand? No, there may be a good reason for it. And when you look deeper, you may be like, oh, he's actually in some unusual kind of trade that involves that for real. So you can open it. But when stuff like that happens, you're supposed to, if you're the bank, I think what you mentioned, do that intermediate level of due diligence just to kind of check things out and make sure that they're okay. So yes, international transactions are part of the layering phase of money laundering traditionally. Of course, there's tons of them and they're legitimate, but it's a reason to look. The IP question specifically, though, is interesting because I don't remember considering that before. So again, I compliment you for bringing that up. That's an interesting point. And I think that point is sort of uniquely related to crypto in a way that it's not related to other transactions. Because if I'm engaging in a long distance financial transaction, I'm going through, even though some elements of that may go over a network, I'm dealing with financial institutions, I'm dealing with people, I'm dealing with physical addresses, so, you know, IP address, whatever. With crypto, it's entirely network oriented. So you're right. I think crypto transactions open the door to geographic identification of IP addresses when determining if the source of these funds is exotic and requires another level of due diligence. But to get to I think what your question is, I haven't seen a formal acknowledgement or recommendation about that, and I think you're a little bit ahead of the curve on that.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, thank you. Paul?
Good. Okay. We don't have any more questions. So Gordon, I think it will be enough for now. And let's plan the next session about the raising of capital.
Sure, sounds great.
Just US and not only US, just for normal business that wants to raise like $1 million, $2 million, $5 million from private investors.
How do you get money? Everyone wants to know. So yes,
yeah, right. How do you promote yourself to get money? Because it's also like needed, like you need to make people aware that you're looking.
Yep. Get money, don't go to jail.
Yeah. Thank you everybody for participating.
Thanks everyone, I appreciate it. Stay
helpful.
safe.
Yeah. Good.
Thanks, talk to you, bye.
A good day, everybody. Bye.